A Dragon with Feathery Wings, Episode 3, Bog Trouble in Little Genshya. The group had been traveling together for about a day now, and Karana still didn't entirely trust Haru. Sure, her gut told her that he was a decent person, but it didn't help his case that she was almost positive that he had given her a fake name. Haru Kiniro sounded like a demon name, and he was clearly a northern elf. He hadn't done anything particularly suspicious since joining the group, but she kept an eye on him regardless. He was fairly quiet and mostly kept to himself. When they would rest, he always seemed to be reading. His bag was stuffed with so many books that Karana had to wonder if he even bothered carrying basic necessities in there at all. As they walked along the road, the lush green fields rapidly turned into a brownish, swampy sludge. Haru stopped and looked around cautiously. "This is odd." "What is it?" Karana asked. "Don't want to get your shoes dirty?" Haru shook his head. "I came this way through New Genshya on my way to Farkon. Only about 2 weeks ago, and there was no swamp here." Okay, he was right. This was weird. Karana looked around. "You're telling me this happened in the last 2 weeks? What the heck turns a place into a swamp that fast?" "Rain?" Ren suggested. "That would have to be some intense rainfall. I highly doubt that," Karana replied. "I may have an idea," Haru mused, "but I can't be sure. For now, let's try and find the town and see if the people of New Genshya are still there." The three of them waded their way through the swamp until they found the sunken remains of the town of New Genshya. Most of the houses were partially underwater or sinking into the mud. The only building that still seemed livable was what appeared to be a church that was built on slightly higher ground. They didn't see any people around, but they could see candlelight flickering in the church windows. "Let's check the church. It looks like the villagers might be in there." They made their way up to the hill and knocked on the door. They heard sudden shuffling on the other side before a wary voice called out, "Who's there?" "Just travelers," Karana called back. "We're just trying to find out what happened here." There was a pause and the sound of the door being unlocked. The doorman opened it and ushered them in. "Quickly, come in. It's not safe out there." They entered and saw dozens of villagers huddled inside the church. Every one of them was a Genshi, a reptilian race native to the country of Genshya on the eastern continent, and they weren't terribly common on the western continent. Only recently had they begun to immigrate to Alkan, and Karana guessed that many of them were first-generation immigrants. She couldn't help but feel pity that this would happen to their home when they had traveled so far to build a new life. She turned to the doorman as he shut and locked the door behind them. He was an older Genshi. His scales were light brown but dulled with age, and the feathers on his spinal ridge were faded and gray. He looked at them with weary eyes. "What's happened here?" Karana asked him. He shook his head. "We aren't sure. A week ago, overnight, our town was suddenly underwater. We planned to evacuate and go to Farkon or Rashtok for aid, but when the first group went out, we heard a roar and screams and then nothing. Since then, we've been too scared to leave the church. There's a monster out there." "That's horrifying," Karana murmured. "The monster have caused this?" "That may be the case," Haru agreed. "I've read of a creature known as a bog dragon. Wherever it goes, the lands turn to swampy wetlands. It feeds on the wildlife and civilians until it has completely destroyed the ecosystem and then moves on." "Are you serious? How have I never heard of this?" "They're not exactly common. Some scholars think they aren't even natural life forms. No one has seen one breed, so it's entirely possible that they're created through forbidden magic experimentation, though that's all just speculation." "That certainly sounds like our situation. I'm sorry you poor folks have found yourselves in this with us. We don't have much food left, but you can stay here with us as long as you need. I don't recommend trying to leave, but if you do manage to make it out alive, please tell someone of our situation so they may send guards to help us." "Don't worry about it," Ren smiled. "We'll take care of the bog dragon for you." Karana Haru looked at Ren. Karana was considering ways to help these people, but fighting anything called a dragon seemed a little insane to her.
You would do that for us? For people you've never met?"
"Of course. Besides, sounds like if we don't take care of this thing, it'll just cause more problems for more folks later on. So I don't see why we toss this over to the guards if we can handle it ourselves." The elder Genshi looked at them in shock, and tears welled in his eyes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I wish we had aid to give, but you can rest here as long as you need.
He moved past them and addressed the huddled villagers inside the church.
Our nightmare is over. These kind travelers have promised to rid us of the curse.
The Genshi looked at one another in disbelief, and frantic whispers could be heard. Kurana whispered angrily to Ren, "What do you think you're doing, Ren? You can't just volunteer us to slay a dragon!" "Did you not want to help them?" "I wanted to do something, sure, but I wasn't going to jump straight to fighting a fucking dragon. Haru, back me up here." Haru sighed heavily. "It doesn't much matter what I think. I ceded my life to Ren. If he wants to throw it away by feeding me to a bog dragon, then I guess that's his prerogative. See, even Haru thinks we're gonna die. We'll be fine. It's just a bog dragon. I didn't really follow what Haru was saying when he told us what it was, but there's 3 of us and 1 of it, so we have that going for us. Bodyguards aren't supposed to take their charge into the belly of a fucking beast, you know. I'm absolutely not helping you. I'm legging it north, and if you survive, you can meet up with me in Rastock." Ren shrugged. "All right, me and Haru can handle it then. I'm going to rest for a bit before we get going." Ren walked off and happily greeted the Genshi villagers, who were already treating him like their savior. He sat down and rummaged through his bag until he found a small loaf of bread he'd been saving. Before he could bite into it, he noticed a young Genshi girl eyeing his food. He smiled at her and she looked away. "You hungry?" he asked, offering the bread to her. She cautiously approached and took it from him.
Thank you, sir. We're running out of food. We can't eat much recently."
"I'm Ren," he greeted her. "What's your name?"
"Shally."
She smiled through a mouthful of bread.
"Thank you so much for helping us. My parents came here and built our home all by themselves. I was really sad that we were going to lose it."
"Are your parents here too?" Ren asked, looking around. He remembered when he was a kid that his parents told him not to talk to strangers, so he wanted to introduce himself to them so he wasn't a stranger anymore.
"My mom died a while ago," Shally said sadly. "My dad went to help with the first group, and he never came back."
Ren ran his hand across her cheek, brushing her tears off her blue scales. "I'll make sure you get to keep that house. And I'll keep an eye out for your dad, too." She smiled at him. Ren hopped to his feet and stretched. "All right, enough sitting around. I've got a bug dragon to find." "Bog dragon," Haru corrected as Ren walked past him towards the door. "Yeah, that guy." Haru looked at Kurana, who had seen Ren's interaction with the child and had her arms folded in indignation. "You coming?" he asked. She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I'm coming." She grumbled curses as the 3 of them left the building. "So how do we find the barn dragon?" Ren asked as they wandered further into the swamp. "Well, it's quite large, so I imagine we'll see or hear it unless it's sleeping. If it's asleep, it will likely be hiding in the mud, so be careful and keep an eye out for mysterious bubbles." "What makes a bubble mysterious?" Ren was suddenly cut off as 2 massive jaws rose from the swamp and swallowed him whole. Where he had been standing was suddenly a massive beast. Kurana and Haru both instinctively jumped back and looked at the creature that had just consumed their ally. Each of its 4 limbs was itself larger than a grown adult, tipped with clawed feet. Its scales were a putrid brown, dripping with mud and spotted with moss. They weren't smooth like a normal dragon's scales, but sharp, almost like spines all over its body. It had no wings, but it swung its massive tail with enough force to splinter a nearby tree clean in half. "I'm not crazy, right?" Kurana called out. "That thing just ate Ren, right?" "It definitely did," Haru replied. "So do we just leave now? He was the one who insisted on fighting this damn thing. It swallowed him whole. If we defeat it, maybe we can get him out." Kurana sighed. "Yeah, okay. Guess we're doing this then." She drew her short sword in one hand and her dagger in the other. Haru didn't have a sword anymore, so he began his attack by slamming his hands into the ground. Spikes of ice erupted from the swamp underneath the dragon, but simply shattered to pieces across its scales. The dragon roared, releasing a horrible stench, and lunged at Haru, who leapt away, as Kurana stabbed both of her blades at the flank of the beast, but they simply glanced off. "Aim for the eyes!" Haru yelled. He used magic to envelop the feet of the creature in mud and then solidify it into hardened earth, allowing Chrono to leap into the air and jam her short sword in its eye. But the bog dragon simply closed its eye, and her blade barely scratched its eyelid. The beast quickly jerked its head to the side and knocked Karana into a nearby tree. Karana heaved as her breath was knocked out of her. Shit, breathing hurt. She definitely had some broken ribs. Regardless, she stood up and wiped the mud from her mouth. All of their attacks were just bouncing off. "We're not getting anywhere with this," Karana called loudly as she could muster as she fled from the bog dragon's jaws coming down on her. Haru scanned the area. "There's a cave that way. If we can get there, we can hide out to get a minute to think." They nodded at each other and began to run for the caves. As the distance closed, it was clear that due to her injury, Karana was falling behind, and the bog dragon was closing in on her quickly. Haru looked back and stopped, allowing Karana to run past him. "Get to the cave! I'll slow it down and catch up." As she ran for the cave, Haru slammed both his hands into the water and called a tremendous torrent over the beast. Then Flash froze it in place. Once it was stopped, he turned and ran towards the cave, but the dragon was only held for a moment before it burst from the ice with renewed vigor. Now furious, it slashed its claw at Haru and caught him in the back just before he could make it in the cave. He stumbled through the entrance and collapsed next to Karana. The dragon tried to bite at them, but the cave entrance was too small, and it simply smashed its head against the rocks over and over, causing the cave to tremble dangerously above them. Karana coughed as she sat against the wall. "Fuck, that hurts. This isn't looking good." "Yeah," Haru said weakly as he tried to lift himself up, but his arms couldn't support him and he fell back down onto the cave floor. "How bad is it?" he asked, gesturing weakly to his back. Karana looked at the wound on his back, 3 long cuts across it. "It's not too deep, but those claws were filthy. This will get infected if we don't do something." "Shit. You don't happen to have white magic training, do you?" Karana shook her head. "If I tried to heal you, I'd probably end up tearing you up instead." As weak as she felt, she had to try and do something. She conjured a small light orb to see by. As she reached for her bag, she realized they weren't alone in there. Not too far from them was the corpse of a Genshi. She looked at it and noticed the same blue scales and orange feathers that the little girl back in the village had had. His chest had been torn open by the dragon. "Looks like he had the same idea as us." Haru looked at the corpse. "Hopefully we turn out better than that." "I think this is that kid's dad," Karana said as she approached the body. She noticed he wore a necklace lined with sharp, small teeth. She held it carefully in her hand. "I've read that Genshi collect the baby teeth of their children and fashion them into necklaces like that." Haru smiled weakly as the bog dragon continued to crash repeatedly into the cave entrance. Karana took the necklace off the body and inhaled deeply to calm herself in spite of the pain in her ribs. "All right, guess we have to survive then. I need to get this necklace back to that kid." She tucked the necklace safely in her pocket and dug through her bag until she produced a bottle of whiskey. "Okay, this is gonna sting. What are you?" She was positioned above Haru now, so he couldn't see as she poured the alcohol over the wounds on his back. He howled out in pain. "Maybe tell me before you do that next time." "I did, you big baby. I'd like more—" "Hold on." Karana interrupted him. "Do you hear that?" They both sat still and silent and listened. The sounds of the dragon trying to get in the cave had stopped, but they could still hear it. It seemed to be writhing and retching, splashing in the bog. Haru managed to lift himself into a sitting position, and the two looked cautiously through the cave entrance. Sure enough, they saw the bog dragon vomiting into the water, blood and partially digested bones flowing like a waterfall out of its mouth into the muddy water. And then they had to blink to make sure they weren't imagining things as they saw Ren rise from the swamp, covered in bile and mud. He thrust his red-bladed venom fang into the sky and smiled at them. "I made it out, guys!" he yelled excitedly. "Ren, watch out!" Karana yelled. The dragon had recovered and was lunging at Ren. He swiftly drew his massive blade, bringing it down hard on the head of the dragon, cracking its scales. It recoiled and roared at him. He hefted the blood baron up in his right hand, as if it didn't weigh almost a ton, if not more, and his venom fang in his left. The dragon was injured, but it wasn't ready to give up. Far from it. It brings its tail around and tries to swat Ren away, but Ren opens his arms wide and catches the tail between his arms, stopping it dead in its tracks like it hit a mountain. He then, sword still in hand, lifted the dragon by its tail over his head and slammed it into the swamp onto its back, causing a wave of mud out in every direction. Ren then leapt into the air and brought his swords down onto the belly of the beast, cleaving through its scales and eviscerating it. The dragon stopped moving, and Ren hopped off its chest and sheathed his swords. As Karana and Haru made their way to him, the swamp, as well as the body of the dragon, began to fade away, as though it was all simply an illusion, though Karana's broken ribs and the wounds on Haru's back were proof that was not the case. Ren looked back as the monster he had felled disappeared. Oh, look at that! Guess it was just made of magic. Thank goodness. I would have felt really bad if I killed an actual dragon. Karana and Haru couldn't help but smile at Ren, who barely seemed fazed by the whole situation. You're unreal, Haru remarked. No, the dragon wasn't real. I'm still here. Karana laughed. Okay, let's get back to the village and hope the Genshya have healers, because the two of us are a little worse for wear here. Ren supported his party members as they limped back to New Genshya. Luckily, the trek was now much easier since the swamp had given way to the rolling fields that were meant to be here in the first place. Upon their return, they saw the villagers already working to repair their homes. One of the Genshi saw them approaching and announced their return to the others. A small group of Genshi, including the elder and Shali, approached them. You've done it, my boy, the elder exclaimed. You've saved our village. How can we ever repay you? Don't worry about it. But if you have any white mages, my friends here could use some healing. Of course! The elder gestured to some of the other villagers to help Karana and Haru. Hold on, Karana said as they were walking towards the medical hut. She knelt down next to Shali and held out the tooth necklace in her hand. This belonged to your father. He asked me to give it to you. He helped us fight the dragon, but he didn't make it. Tears filled the little girl's eyes. Thank you. Thank you for everything. She hugged Karana tightly. Ow! And Karana ran her hand comfortingly through her feathers. Lying to kids now? Haru teased when Karana returned to the group. Karana shrugged. Ow. Figure it doesn't hurt for her to think her dad's a hero. Not like we need all the credit. Being a hero seems like a hassle anyway. Thank you so much for listening to A Dragon with Feathery Wings, Episode 3. Hopefully you enjoyed Haru's first stint here as a member of the party. Soon, I think I would like to do one of those side episodes I mentioned before. They'll just be more educational and explain about the world more to you guys. The story is designed that you should be able to understand just about everything in it without needing to listen to any of my explaining about the world in these side episodes, but I'll put them out there for anyone who is interested in knowing more about the world, completely optional. So for the first one, I'm thinking of either explaining more about angels and their history and what exactly they are, Genshi, as we saw a lot of Genshi in this episode, or how magic works in this world. If you have any opinions on that, feel free to let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to give a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. And if you want to see where Ren, Karana, and Haru go next, go ahead and follow to see when new episodes come out. If you're interested in seeing more of me, I do stream on twitch.tv/chaosofgreed. It's a gameplay channel. It doesn't have anything to do with this story, but I thought I'd plug it there anyway. If you aren't interested, thank you so much for making it this far anyway, and have a wonderful day.